The Chicago night fell like a soaked velvet curtain. The only light filtering through the thick cloud cover was the city's artificial aura, casting a sickly, jaundiced orange glow. The first autumn rain had been relentless, turning the asphalt streets into glistening black rivers that mirrored the garish, soulless neon of shuttered storefronts. A siren wailed in the distance, a familiar lonely melody in the symphony of the urban night. For Enzo Duca, that sound was a grim reminder. His breath came in ragged, sharp bursts, each cold inhale a fresh torment to his burning lungs. He pressed his back against the cold brick wall of a derelict warehouse bordering Lake Michigan, the scent of damp decay and rust assaulting his senses. His designer white shirt was now a tattered ruin, smeared with mud, and a deepening crimson stain blooming from his left shoulder. The pain was a sharp, pulsing beat in time with his heart, a low fire searing through muscle and bone. He gritted his teeth, willing it away. Pain was an old friend, a familiar companion in his world. Over there, he ran toward the lakefront. The shout echoed, tearing through the rain. The voice belonged to Marco Baldini, a man who just last week had sat across from him, laughing as they shared a glass of expensive grappa. Now he was leading the pack of wolves hunting him. Betrayal-like pain was a taste Enzo knew all too well. Headlights from two black sedans swept the alley, stark white beams cutting through the gloom. Enzo held his breath, his body melting into the deeper shadows. He could hear their footsteps, heavy and urgent, splashing through the puddles, the metallic click of safeties being disengaged. 6 of them, he calculated an internal purge, a coup orchestrated by the very men he once called family. The Duca name was no longer a fortress. It had become a trap. There was no way back. Behind him, Lake Michigan stretched into an infinite inky blackness, its surface as cold and unforgiving as a shattered mirror. The wind gusting off the water carried an icy spray that made his wound throb with a fresh wave of agony. He had only one choice: survival at any cost. As the first silhouettes appeared at the mouth of the alley, Enzo didn't hesitate. He burst from the shadows, his legs pumping in a desperate, powerful sprint toward the concrete pier. Gunshots erupted behind him, the deafening cracks echoing between the buildings. Pop, pop. Bullets chewed up the ground around his feet, kicking up sparks as they ricocheted off the gravel. One seared past his cheek a hot, angry wasp. He felt the warm trickle of blood trace a path down his jaw. "Don't let him get away!" Marco roared, his voice distorted by rage and the driving rain. Enzo summoned his last reserves of strength, vaulted over the safety railing, and threw himself into the dark water below. The impact was like hitting a wall of ice. The bone-deep cold shocked his system, threatening to seize his muscles. He fought the instinct to gasp, forcing himself to swim, using his good right arm to propel himself away from the shore, deeper into the lake's suffocating embrace. Water filled his ears, drowning out the gunshots and the shouts from the pier. The underwater silence was terrifying, but it was, a sanctuary. He held his breath, his chest feeling like it would implode. But as he tried to surface for air, a blinding, tearing pain exploded in his left shoulder, making him see stars. The bullet. It had lodged itself deeper than he thought. His blood began to cloud the water around him, a ghostly red plume in the darkness. His vision blurred at the edges. His strength was failing. His consciousness began to recede, pulling him down into a void even blacker and colder than the water engulfing him. He was drowning. The final thought that drifted through his mind was one of bitter irony. Enzo Duca, the man they called the ghost in Chicago's underworld, who had survived countless territorial wars, was going to die like a rat in a lake. Marina Gallo's old Vespa sputtered in protest as she turned onto the deserted lakefront road. It was almost midnight. The rain was coming down harder now, cold, persistent drops that soaked through the thin fabric of her gallows pizza delivery jacket, making her shiver. This was the last delivery of the night, an extra-large pepperoni, to an address in the old warehouse district, a place no sane person would venture at this hour. But she needed the money. The towering stacks of architectural textbooks, the rent for her tiny apartment, and the dream of one day opening her own design studio wouldn't pay for themselves. The scooter's weak headlight barely cut through the oppressive darkness, illuminating only a few feet of wet road ahead. The rain fell in a thick, distorting sheet, blurring the world into a watercolor of dark blues and grays. Marina sighed, questioning for the 100th time her choice of a side job. She was only months away from graduating, but the future felt as uncertain as the path in front of her. Suddenly, she slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding on the slick asphalt. Two black sedans were parked sideways, blocking the road, their high beams cutting through the downpour. A group of men in dark suits climbed out, weapons glinting in the harsh light. Marina's heart stopped. She instantly killed the engine and the headlight, wrestling the Vespa into a thicket of overgrown bushes at the side of the road, praying the darkness would swallow her whole. She crouched behind a large oak tree, her body trembling from a mixture of cold and pure, unadulterated fear. This wasn't a movie. This was real. She could smell the faint, acrid scent of gunpowder in the air, mingling with the smell of rain and wet earth. She heard them yelling a harsh mix of English and Italian curses. They were looking for someone. Then she heard the gunshots, a series of them, sharp and final. Her heart hammered against her ribs so loud she was terrified they would hear it. She saw a figure bolt from an alley, a desperate shadow running toward the lake. The men opened fire. The figure leaped over the railing and vanished into the black water. An eerie silence followed, broken only by the drumming of the rain and the soft lapping of waves against the pier. "Damn it, he went in the lake!" a voice shouted, thick with frustration. "No way he survives that. The water's freezing, and he was hit." "He's finished for sure," another voice agreed. "Let's go, Marco. The boss won't be happy if we linger." The men piled back into their cars. Doors slammed shut, engines roared to life, and the two sedans sped away, leaving behind only the rain and the echoing silence. Marina remained frozen behind the tree, barely daring to breathe. She waited 5 minutes, 10, nothing, just the relentless rain and the oppressive darkness. But the image of the man plunging into the lake was burned into her mind. He was hit, one of them had said. No way he survives that. But what if he was still out there? A crazy thought sparked in her mind, a thought that any rational person would have dismissed instantly. But Marina wasn't always rational. Her mother had died when she was young, and her father, a gentle pizza maker with flour-dusted hands, had taught her one thing above all else. You never turn your back on a life that needs saving. She didn't know who that man was. He was probably a criminal, a bad person. But he was also a human being, and he was dying. "Damn it," she whispered to herself, her voice a fragile tremor. She shrugged off her soaked delivery jacket, letting it fall to the ground. Her sneakers followed. Dressed in only a thin t-shirt and jeans, she stepped out from her hiding spot and ran toward the pier. The cold wind whipped at her skin, but she didn't feel it. She stared down at the black, undisturbed surface of the water. Not a ripple, not a sign of life. Maybe they were right. He was already gone, but she couldn't just walk away. She couldn't live with the thought that she had done nothing. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Marina Gallo, architecture student and part-time pizza girl, leaped into the freezing, merciless waters of Lake Michigan. The cold was a physical blow, 1,000 needles piercing her skin. She almost screamed from the thermal shock. Water rushed into her mouth, her nose. She fought to stay calm, forcing her eyes open, trying to penetrate the murky darkness of the lake. Nothing, just an oppressive blackness and a dead, silent weight. She broke the surface, coughing and sputtering, gasping for air. The rain hammered down, plastering her hair to her face. "Hello?" She shouted, her voice small and lost in the vastness. "Is anyone there?" No answer. She took another breath and dived again, swimming further out this time. Her lungs began to burn. Panic started to creep in. This was a stupid, suicidal idea. She was going to die out here. But then in the faint, diffused light from the distant skyscrapers, she saw it. A dark, ethereal cloud unfurling in the water. Blood. Her heart leaped. She swam toward it, her movements frantic now, and then she saw him, a human form suspended in the water, slowly, gracefully sinking toward the bottom. His dark hair floated around his pale face like a halo of shadows. His eyes were closed. He was no longer moving. With a final desperate surge of adrenaline, Marina swam down her arms, reaching her fingers, closing around the rough fabric of his jacket. He was heavy, an anchor of dead weight. She wrapped an arm around his chest, kicking with all her might, her own lungs screaming for oxygen. The ascent felt impossibly slow, an eternity of fighting against the pull of the depths. Her head broke the surface with a gasp. She coughed, taking in huge gulps of air, all while holding on to him. His head lulled back, his face as white as marble in the dim light. He wasn't breathing. "No, no, no," she sobbed, her tears mixing with the rain and the lake water. She started kicking, dragging his dead weight toward the shore. It was the hardest thing she had ever done. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest. Her limbs felt like lead. The cold was making her clumsy. Her thoughts slow and muddled. Finally, her feet touched the muddy bottom. She stumbled, half carrying, half dragging him out of the water and onto the slick, grassy bank. She collapsed beside him, her body shaking uncontrollably, her chest heaving. She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time, even unconscious, bruised and bleeding. He was beautiful, in a dangerous, predatory way. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, lips that were somehow both cruel and sensual. He looked like a fallen angel, a very, very dangerous one. There was a dark, oozing hole in his shoulder. She pressed her hands against it, trying to staunch the flow of blood, her small fingers looking stark and pale against the dark fabric of his suit. His skin was ice cold. "Come on," she whispered, her teeth chattering. "Breathe, please, just breathe." She tilted his head back, pinched his nose, and pressed her mouth to his. She blew air into his lungs once, twice. She pressed on his chest, counting her mind a frantic blur of half-remembered first aid lessons. 1, 2, 3, 4. Nothing. He was gone. Tears of frustration and despair streamed down her face. She had been too late. She had risked her own life for nothing. She slumped over him, her forehead resting on his cold chest, a sob tearing through her. And then, beneath her ear, she heard it, a faint sputtering cough, a ragged, desperate intake of air. His eyes fluttered open. For a second, they were unfocused, lost in a fog of pain and near death. Then they focused on her. They were the color of dark emeralds, startlingly intense, even in the dim light. They weren't grateful. They weren't relieved. They were sharp, analytical, and filled with a chilling authority. His lips parted, and he spoke, his voice a raw, growly whisper that sent a shiver down her spine, a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. "Who are you?" The question hung in the air between them, sharp and demanding, cutting through the sound of the rain. Marina stared back into those emerald eyes, her own fear momentarily replaced by a jolt of indignant anger. She had just pulled him from a watery grave, and his first words were an interrogation. "I'm the person who just saved your life," she retorted, her voice trembling but firm. She was still pressing her hands against his shoulder, and she could feel the warm stickiness of his blood seeping through her fingers. The reality of her situation crashed down on her. She was alone in the middle of the night with a bleeding gunshot man who looked like he wrestled demons for a living. Enzo's eyes narrowed, scanning her feet, then her simple clothes, then the abandoned pizza box lying near her discarded jacket. A delivery girl. The irony was almost comical. He tried to push himself up, a grunt of pain escaping his lips as his shoulder protested. "Don't move." Marina commanded, her voice taking on a surprising note of authority. "You'll make it worse." He ignored her, managing to prop himself up on his good elbow. His gaze swept the dark shoreline, his senses on high alert, searching for any sign of lingering threats. The sedans were gone. The silence was absolute. He was alive for now, thanks to this girl who smelled of rain and oregano and had the most startlingly determined hazel eyes he'd ever seen. "They're gone," she said, reading his thoughts. "They thought you were dead." He finally looked back at her, his expression unreadable. "And you didn't—" "I wasn't sure," she admitted honestly. "I couldn't just leave you." A flicker of something surprised curiosity passed through his eyes before the cold mask slipped back into place. "That was a mistake," he rasped, his voice raw. "Getting involved with me is a mistake." "Well, it's a little late for that, isn't it?" She shot back, her fear giving way to a stubborn practicality. "We need to get you out of here. You're losing too much blood. Can you stand?" Enzo gritted his teeth, and with her help, staggered to his feet. The world tilted violently, and he leaned heavily against her. She was smaller than he'd expected, but surprisingly strong, her shoulder digging into his ribs as she supported his weight. For a man used to commanding absolute power, the act of depending on this stranger was a new and deeply unsettling form of vulnerability. "My scooter, it's over there." She pointed into the darkness. It took them an eternity to cross the short distance, each step a fresh agony for Enzo. By the time they reached the Vespa, his breathing was shallow, and a cold sweat beaded on his forehead. Marina looked at him, then at the tiny scooter, then back at him. The absurdity of the situation was overwhelming. "There's no way," Enzo muttered, shaking his head. "We don't have a choice," Marina insisted. She somehow managed to heave him onto the seat behind her, his large frame nearly swallowing the small vehicle. She started the engine, which sputtered to life with a pathetic cough. "Where are we going?" he asked, his voice weak against her ear. Marina hesitated. The hospital was out of the question. A gunshot wound would bring the police. And judging by the firefight she'd just witnessed, that was the last thing this man needed. Her own apartment was a tiny one-room studio. There was nowhere to hide him. Her mind raced, sifting through possibilities. There was only one place. It was risky, stupidly risky, but it was the only option she had. A friend's place, she lied, twisting the throttle. "It's close." The Vespa lurched forward, wobbling precariously under their combined weight. Enzo's good arm wrapped around her waist. His hands played against her stomach in a desperate grip to keep himself from falling. His touch was like a brand, a searing heat that shot through the thin fabric of her shirt. Marina's breath hitched. She could feel the hard planes of his chest pressed against her back. The faint masculine scent of his cologne. Something expensive mixed with the metallic tang of blood, filling her senses. It was intimate and terrifying all at once. They drove through the deserted Rains streets, a strange and desperate pair, on a sputtering scooter, him bleeding and half-conscious, her driving with a reckless determination she didn't know she possessed. She glanced back every few seconds, half expecting to see the black sedans reappear in her rearview mirror. The friend's place was her father's pizzeria. It was closed for the night, the windows dark. She fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get the lock open. She helped Enzo inside, the familiar smell of yeast tomatoes and garlic wrapping around them. It was the scent of her childhood of safety. Tonight, it felt like a fragile shield against the violent world she had just stumbled into. She guided him through the darkened dining area, past the checkered tablecloths and empty chairs, and into the small storage room at the back. She lowered him onto a pile of flour sacks, his head falling back against the rough canvas with a soft thud. He was paler now, his breathing more labored. "Stay with me," she said, her voice sharp with urgency. She flicked on the single bare bulb that hung from the ceiling, casting the room in a harsh yellow light. The wound on his shoulder was a mess, a dark, ragged tear in his flesh. It needed more than just a bandage. It needed a doctor. She ran into the kitchen, grabbing a first aid kit, a bottle of whiskey from her father's medicinal stash, and a clean stack of kitchen towels. When she returned, his eyes were closed, his face beaded with sweat. For a terrifying moment, she thought she had lost him again. "Hey," she said, gently shaking his good shoulder, "don't you dare die in my flour sacks. My dad will kill me." His eyes slowly opened, the emerald green now clouded with pain. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Priorities," he whispered hoarsely. Her heart did a strange little flip. She ignored it. "This is going to hurt," she warned, uncapping the whiskey. He simply nodded, his jaw tightening in anticipation. Marina took a deep breath. She had never done anything like this before. The most serious injury she'd ever treated was a scraped knee at the preschool. She poured the whiskey over the wound. Enzo hissed, his body arching in agony, but he didn't cry out. A string of guttural Italian curses escaped his lips, but his eyes remained fixed on her. She worked quickly, her hands surprisingly steady. She cleaned the wound as best she could, her touch gentle but efficient. He watched her the entire time, his intense gaze never leaving her face, making her feel both scrutinized and seen. It was as if he was memorizing her, deconstructing her with the same focus he'd used to scan the shoreline for enemies. "You're a student," he stated. Not a question. She paused, surprised. "How did you know? Your hands?" He said, his voice a low murmur. "They're soft, but there's ink on your finger, and you're too young to be doing this for a living." She looked down at the faint blue smudge on her index finger, a remnant from her drafting class. He was observant, dangerously so. "Architecture," she said quietly, returning to her task. "Final year." He was silent for a moment. An architect, he mused the words, slurring slightly as exhaustion took over. "You build things. I break them." Before she could respond, his eyes rolled back and his head slumped to the side. He had passed out. Marina sat back on her heels, her heart pounding. She had a half-dead Mafia soldier bleeding out in her father's pizzeria. She looked at his face, now peaceful in unconsciousness. The harsh lines softened. He looked younger, almost vulnerable. She had saved his life, but in doing so, she had a terrifying feeling that she had just destroyed her own. The first light of dawn was a weak gray smear against the grimy windows of the storage room when Enzo woke. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. The scent of garlic and baking bread filled his nostrils, a disorienting aroma that belonged to a different, softer world. Then the pain in his shoulder flared, a white, hot reminder of the night's events, the chase, the lake, the girl. He sat up slowly, his head pounding. He was shirtless. A clean, thick bandage was expertly wrapped around his shoulder and chest. His own blood-soaked shirt and jacket were folded neatly on a nearby crate. He looked down at himself, surprised by the clean, precise work. It was far better than the clumsy field dressings he'd gotten from his own men. The door creaked open, and she stepped in holding a steaming mug. "Marina." Her hair was damp, pulled back in a loose ponytail, and she wore a faded university sweatshirt that made her look even younger. There were dark circles under her eyes. She clearly hadn't slept. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her voice hushed. She avoided his eyes, her gaze fixed on the mug in her hands. "Like I've been shot and left for dead in a lake," he answered, his voice still rough. "Which I suppose I was." She offered him the mug. "It's just broth, my dad. He swears by it." Enzo took it, his fingers brushing against hers. Her skin was warm. He took a sip. The savory hot liquid was a shock to his system, a simple comfort he hadn't experienced in years. He drank it all, the warmth spreading through his chilled body. "I need to leave," he said, setting the empty mug down. "They'll be looking for me, not just them. Everyone." "You can't," she said flatly. "You've lost too much blood, and you probably have a fever. You'd collapse before you got a block away. Besides," she added, a note of defiance in her voice, "they think you're at the bottom of the lake. The longer you stay hidden, the safer you are." He studied her again, this time with a more critical eye. She wasn't just a naive girl who had acted on a foolish impulse. There was a core of steel beneath her quiet exterior. "Why?" He asked, the single word carrying the weight of his confusion. "Why did you do it?" "You saw what happened. You knew what I was." Marina finally met his gaze, her hazel eyes clear and unwavering. "I saw a man who was going to die. The rest didn't matter in that moment." She hugged her arms around herself. "My mother was a nurse. She used to say that you don't get to choose who you save, you just save them." The mention of her mother, the simple, unshakable morality of her words, struck a chord deep inside Enzo, a place he thought had long since turned to stone. His own mother. He pushed the thought away. Memories were a weakness he couldn't afford. "Your mother was a good woman." He said the words feeling inadequate. She was also naive. This world isn't that simple. Maybe not. Marina conceded. "But right now, you're in my world. And in my world, we don't let people bleed to death on flour sacks." She gestured around the small, cramped room. "This isn't much, but it's safe for now. My father won't be here until this afternoon. You need to rest." Enzo knew she was right. His body was a wreck and his mind was a chaotic storm. He needed time to think to plan his next move. The Baldini crew had made their play, which meant his own organization was in turmoil. He was a boss without a throne, a ghost without a shadow. He was exposed, and for the first time in a decade, he was truly alone. Except he wasn't. He was with her. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer than before. "Marina." "Marina." He repeated the name, feeling strange and foreign on his tongue. "I'm Enzo." He offered no last name. She didn't ask for one. He lay back against the sacks, the exhaustion hitting him like a physical blow. Marina watched him for a moment, a storm of conflicting emotions wearing within her. She had just brought the city's violent underworld into the sanctuary of her father's shop. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to call the police, to pretend this never happened. But when she looked at him, at the vulnerability etched on his face in the harsh light, she couldn't. She had made a choice when she jumped into that lake, and now she had to live with it. She left him to rest quietly, closing the door behind her. In the main pizzeria, the morning light was filtering in painting stripes across the floor. She started the familiar routine of her part-time job, wiping down tables, refilling salt shakers, preparing the dough for her father. The simple, repetitive tasks were a comfort, a way to impose order on a world that had suddenly spiraled into chaos. But as she worked, her mind was racing. Who was Enzo? What had he done to make those men want him dead so badly? And most importantly, what was she going to do now? Hours later, she brought him more broth and some bread. He was awake, sitting up, his expression more alert, more dangerous. The brief moment of vulnerability was gone. The boss was back. "I made some calls," he said, his voice low and controlled. He held up a sleek, impossibly thin satellite phone she hadn't seen before. "My people, the ones who are still loyal, are looking for a safe house. I'll be out of your way by tonight." A strange pang of something disappointment. Relief shot through her. "Good," she said, her voice more clipped than she intended. "My father will be here soon." "About your father," Enzo said, his eyes locking onto hers. "He can't know. No one can. If they find out you helped me, you and he will become targets. Leverage, do you understand?" The word leverage sent a chill down her spine. She nodded, her throat suddenly dry. "When I leave Tal," he continued, his tone leaving no room for argument, "you will forget this happened. You will go back to your classes, your pizza deliveries. You will forget you ever saw me. It's the only way to keep you safe." "And what about you?" She found herself asking the question, slipping out before she could stop it, his lips twisted into a humorless smile. "Don't worry about me, Arquitito. I'm a ghost, remember? I'm good at disappearing." But as he spoke, the sound of a key turning in the front lock of the pizzeria made them both freeze. It was too early. Her father wasn't due for hours. Marina's heart leaped into her throat. Enzo was on his feet in an instant, his body tense, his hand reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. He moved with a silent, fluid grace that was terrifying to watch, pressing himself flat against the wall beside the storage room door, his emerald eyes blazing with a deadly focus. The front door opened. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed through the empty dining room. It wasn't her father's familiar shuffling gait. These were the steps of a hunter. "Marina," Enzo whispered, his voice a cold, deadly command against her ear. "Get behind me, now!" The footsteps stopped just outside the storage room. A heavy silence descended, thick with menace, broken only by the frantic pounding of Marina's heart against her ribs. She was pressed into the corner behind Enzo, his body a solid, unyielding wall between her and whatever was on the other side of the door. She could feel the heat radiating from him, a stark contrast to the icy fear coursing through her veins. He was a predator cornered, and the air around him crackled with a lethal energy. A shadow fell across the thin crack of light under the door. "I know you're in there, Duca," a voice called out, smooth and laced with a chilling amusement. It was Marco Baldini. "Did you really think you could just swim away? The boss wants to have a word. He's not happy about the mess you made." Enzo remained perfectly still. His breathing controlled his focus absolute. He glanced down at Marina, his eyes conveying a silent, urgent message. "Don't make a sound. Come on out, Enzo." Marco's voice dripped with false camaraderie. "Let's talk. We can make a deal. No need for anyone else to get hurt, especially not the little pizza girl." Marina's blood ran cold. He knew. He knew she was here. How her mind reeled. The Vespa. She had left it in the bushes, but maybe they had come back. Or maybe they had tracked Enzo somehow. She felt a wave of nausea. She had led them here. She had brought this danger to her father's doorstep. Enzo's jaw tightened, a muscle feathering along his cheek. He knew what making a deal meant in their world. It meant a bullet to the back of the head in a quiet place. But Marco's mention of Marina changed the equation. She was leveraged now, just as he had feared. Last chance, Duca. Marco warned, his tone hardening. "I've got 3 men with me. We can either do this easy, or we can redecorate this charming little pizza joint." Enzo knew he had seconds to act. His injured shoulder throbbed, a dull, aching fire, but he pushed the pain aside. He scanned the small storage room, his mind working with a speed and clarity honed by years of life or death situations. Flour sacks, a heavy metal shelf stacked with cans of tomatoes, a meat cleaver hanging from a magnetic strip on the wall. Not much, but it would have to do. He met Marina's terrified gaze. He saw the guilt and the fear warring in her eyes. In that split second, a fierce protective instinct he hadn't felt in a long time surged through him. She had saved his life. He would not let her die for it. He put a finger to his lips, then pointed to the heavy shelving unit. His meaning was clear. Without a word, Marina nodded, understanding. "All right, Marco." Enzo called out, his voice surprisingly calm and steady. "You win. I'm coming out. Just, I'm hurt. I'm moving slow." "No tricks." Enzo. Marco chuckled, but there was a note of relief in his voice. He thought he had won. "No tricks," Enzo echoed. He took a deep, silent breath, and with a nod to Marina, he reached for the doorknob. The moment the door began to open, everything happened at once. Enzo kicked the door outward with all his strength, slamming it into the man standing directly in front of it. The man grunted, staggering back. In the same fluid motion, Enzo grabbed a handful of flour from the nearest open sack and threw it into the faces of the two men behind him. A cloud of white powder exploded in the narrow hallway, temporarily blinding them. They coughed and sputtered, their eyes stinging. It was the only distraction Enzo needed. He lunged forward, ignoring the searing pain in his shoulder, and drove his fist into the throat of the first man, who crumpled to the ground, gagging. At the same time, Marina, acting on pure adrenaline, pushed against the heavy metal shelf with all her might. It teetered for a heart-topping second, then crashed forward with a deafening roar of screeching metal and shattering jars. Cans of tomatoes rained down, rolling across the floor like bloody cannonballs, creating a chaotic, slippery obstacle course. One of the blinded men slipped on a rolling can, his feet flying out from under him. He landed hard on his back, his gun clattering across the tile floor. Marco, who had been standing back, cursed and raised his own weapon, but Enzo was already on him. He moved not like a man with a bullet in his shoulder, but like the ghost of his reputation. He slammed Marco's gun hand against the wall with a sickening crack of bone. The gun fell. Marco screamed in pain and fury. Enzo didn't stop. He drove a knee into Marco's stomach, doubling him over, then brought his elbow down hard on the back of his neck. Marco collapsed in a heap, unconscious. The last man, his vision finally clearing, stared in disbelief at the scene of carnage. His three comrades were down, and Enzo was standing over them, his chest heaving, his face a mask of cold fury, dusted white with flour, like some avenging spirit. The man hesitated for only a second, but it was a second too long. Enzo snatched the fallen gun from the floor. The click of the safety being released was the loudest sound in the room. The man dropped his own weapon and raised his hands in surrender. "Don't shoot," he stammered. "Please." Enzo's emerald eyes were chips of ice. "Get them out of here," he commanded, his voice a low growl. "And you tell Don Valente that if he ever comes near her again, I won't just break his organization. I will burn it to the ground with him inside it. Do you understand?" The man nodded frantically, his eyes wide with terror. He scrambled to help his dazed and groaning partners, dragging them out of the pizzeria and into the waiting cars. Within a minute, they were gone. Silence returned, thick and heavy, smelling of flour, whiskey, and blood. Marina was still standing in the doorway of the storage room, her body trembling, her knuckles white from gripping the doorframe. She stared at the scene before her. The overturned shelf, the scattered cans, the dark smears of blood on the clean tile floor, and she stared at Enzo. He stood in the middle of the chaos he had created, the gun held loosely at his side. his body finally starting to betray the immense effort he had just expended. A fresh wave of red was soaking through the bandage on his shoulder. He looked at her, and for the first time, the mask was gone. In his eyes, she saw not just the cold killer, but the exhaustion, the pain, and a flicker of something else. A silent acknowledgement, a shared survival. "You were right," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I couldn't have made it a block." He took a shaky step and his legs finally gave out. He crumpled to the floor, the gun clattering beside him. Marina rushed to his side, her earlier fear replaced by a new, more terrifying emotion. She knelt down, cradling his head in her lap. He was burning up with fever, his breathing shallow. "Enzo," she whispered, her hand brushing the flour from his dark hair. "Enzo, stay with me." His eyes fluttered open, struggling to focus on her face. "You build things, architecto." He murmured his words faint and dreamlike. "Build me a wall, a high one." Then his eyes closed, and he was still. Marina sat there in the wreckage of her father's pizzeria, holding the unconscious Mafia boss in her arms, as the morning sun finally broke through the clouds, flooding the room with a light that felt 1,000,000 miles away. She was no longer just a delivery girl who had saved a stranger. She was a part of his world now, and she had no idea how deep the darkness went. The next few days passed in a surreal, feverish haze. Marina, running on caffeine and sheer willpower, transformed the cramped storage room into a makeshift infirmary. She dragged a small cot from the tiny apartment above the shop, covering it with clean linens that smelled of her father's fabric softener. She kept Enzo's fever down with cool compresses and forced sips of water and broth between his bouts of delirium. Her father, Leo Gallo, was a simple, kind-hearted man whose life revolved around the rhythm of dough rising and ovens heating. When he arrived that first afternoon to find his storage room in chaos and a wounded stranger on his flour sacks, his face went pale with shock. Marina, with a conviction that surprised even herself, told him a half-truth. "He was in a car accident, Papa." She said, her voice steady. "Some men were chasing him. He had nowhere else to go. We have to help him." Leo looked from his daughter's determined face to the unconscious man on the cot. He saw the gunshot wound, the bruises, the hard, dangerous lines of Enzo's features. He was no fool. This was not a simple car accident. This was trouble, the kind of trouble he had spent his entire life avoiding. But he also saw the pleading in his daughter's boss and the same fierce compassion that had defined her late mother. He sighed, a sound heavy with resignation. "You have your mother's heart, Mia," he said softly, his Italian accent thick. "And it will get you into trouble one day." He looked at Enzo again. "We help him, but when he is strong enough, he must go. We are not a part of this world." So they conspired in secret. During the day, Leo and Marina ran the pizzeria as if nothing was wrong. The cheerful sounds of customers and the smell of baking pizza, a bizarre curtain for the life or death drama unfolding in the back room. At night, Marina became a nurse. She changed Enzo's bandages, her touch becoming more confident, less hesitant. She learned the landscape of his body, the top muscles, the old, faded scars that told stories of a life she couldn't begin to imagine, and the new, angry wound that tied his fate to hers. During his fever dreams, Enzo talked. He spoke in a mix of Italian and English, his words fragmented and raw. He murmured names. Marco, Valente, his voice laced with a venomous anger. He spoke of shadows and betrayal, but sometimes he would whisper another name, a woman's name, Sophia. His voice filled with a profound, heart-wrenching sorrow. In those moments, Marina would find herself gently wiping the sweat from his brow. A strange ache in her own chest. On the third day, the fever broke. Enzo woke up, his mind clear for the first time. He found Marina asleep in a chair beside his cot, her head resting on a folded apron, a textbook on Renaissance architecture open on her lap. The morning light streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and casting a soft glow on her face. She looked young, peaceful, utterly out of place in the violent narrative of his life. He watched her for a long time, a silent observer. He noted the way her brow furrowed slightly in her sleep, the stubborn set of her jaw even in repose. She had not only saved him, she had protected him, hidden him, and nursed him back from the brink. She had done it without asking for anything in return, armed with nothing but kitchen towels, whiskey, and a stubborn belief in doing the right thing. It was a level of selfless loyalty he had never encountered before. In his world, loyalty was a commodity, bought and sold, and always, always conditional. He shifted, and the movement woke her. Her eyes blinked open, hazy with sleep, then widened as she realized he was awake and lucid. "You're back," she said, a small, tired smile touching her lips. "Thanks to you," he replied, his voice still. He sat up, swinging his legs over the side of the cot. The pain was still there, but it was a dull, manageable ache. "Now, owe you my life, Marina." "You don't owe me anything," she said, standing up and stretching. "Just get better and get out of here before my father has a heart attack." "I meant what I said." Enzo insisted, his gaze intense. "The Ducas, my family, we pay our debts." For the first time, he had given her a name that in certain circles of Chicago was spoken only in whispers. Marina's blood ran cold, but she hid her fear. "I don't want your money, Enzo. I just want my life back." Before he could answer, the bell above the pizzeria's front door jingled. It was early for customers. Leo Gallo's voice, friendly and welcoming, drifted from the front. "Welcome to Gallo's. Be with you in a moment." A different voice replied, a voice that was smooth-cultured and utterly chilling. "No rush. I'm just here to see an old friend." Enzo froze. He knew that voice. It belonged to Antonio Valente, the new dawn of the rival family, the man who had orchestrated the coup, the man who wanted him dead more than anyone. Enzo was on his feet in an instant, his mind racing. Valente wouldn't come alone, and he wouldn't come to talk. He was here to finish the job. He looked around the storage room. No weapons, no escape route. The back door led to a narrow walled-in alley, a dead end. They were trapped. He grabbed Marina's arm, his grip like iron. "Stay here and stay quiet," he hissed, his eyes blazing. He moved to the door, pressing his ear against the wood, listening. "I'm looking for a man." Valente's voice was closer now, just on the other side of the kitchen door. Dark hair, green eyes, answers to Enzo. "Perhaps you've seen him." Enzo Leo's voice was laced with carefully feigned confusion. "No, no one by that name here. Just me and my daughter. Can I get you a slice on the house? I'm not hungry." Valente replied coldly. "My men tell me he was seen in this area a few nights ago. A little pizza girl helped him." "Sound familiar?" Marina's breath caught in her throat. Enzo shot her a look that was both a warning and strangely a reassurance. In the front, Leo Gallo wiped his hands on his apron, his heart pounding, but his face a mask of weary innocence. "Senor, I don't know what you're talking about. My daughter works hard. She wouldn't get involved in whatever this is." There was a moment of tense silence. Then Valente laughed, a low, cruel sound. "You're a bad liar, old man, just like your wife was." The words hit Leo like a physical blow. He staggered back, his face draining of color. What did you say about my wife?" Inside the storage room, Enzo saw Marina's face twist in confusion and horror. My mother. What does he know about my mother? She whispered frantically. Enzo's own mind was spinning. Your wife. Valente's words echoed, unlocking a dark, forgotten corner of his memory. Years ago, before he took over, his father had spoken of a loose end, a witness to a deal gone bad, a nurse, a woman named Gallo. Oh, God. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't a coincidence. It was never a coincidence. Marina hadn't just stumbled into his world. She had been born on its bloody fringes. Her act of saving him hadn't been a random act of kindness. It was fate, a cruel, twisted knot tying their past together. My men are going to search your shop, Pizzaiolo. Valente said, his voice dropping to a deadly purr. And when we find him, I will make sure your daughter pays for her mother's mistake. Enzo knew they had run out of time. He grabbed the meat cleaver from the wall, its weight cold and familiar in his hand. He looked at Marina, at the terror and confusion in her eyes. He had to get her out. He pointed to the small, high window at the back of the room, the one that led to the dead-end alley. Climb, he commanded. Now, don't look back. As the kitchen door burst open, Enzo kicked over a stack of flour sacks, creating a white, dusty, smokic screen, and charged forward. The cleaver held high. He was no longer a ghost. He was a storm, and he would tear down the world to keep her safe. The storage room exploded into chaos. The white cloud of flour hung in the air, a ghostly fog that momentarily disoriented Valente's men as they stormed in. It was all the time Enzo needed. He moved with the brutal efficiency of a man who had made violence his language. The meat cleaver in his hand was not an elegant weapon, but in his grip it became a terrifying extension of his will. The first man through the door only had time to register a flicker of movement before Enzo brought the flat of the cleaver down on his wrist. The sound of bone cracking was sickeningly loud. The man screamed, dropping his gun, and Enzo kicked it under the shelving unit. He didn't kill. Not here. Not in front of her. This was about survival, not slaughter. He used the man as a shield, shoving him into the second thug who was raising his weapon. Marina, frozen for a heartbeat, was jolted into action by Enzo's roar. Marina, go! She scrambled onto a stack of tomato crates, her hands reaching for the grimy window ledge. It was high, almost too high. Her fingers slipped on the damp metal frame. Below her, the fight was a blur of motion and desperate sound. Enzo was a whirlwind of controlled fury, using the cramped space to his advantage, turning flour sacks and crates into weapons and obstacles. He was outnumbered and injured, but he was fighting on his home turf, now the world of desperation and violence. Valente stood in the doorway, a cruel smile playing on his lips as he watched the brawl, his tailored suit immaculate amidst the chaos. He made no move to join content to watch his wolves try to take down the wounded lion. He raised his own silver-plated pistol, not at Enzo, but aiming deliberately towards the window where Marina was struggling. Going somewhere to sorrow. He called out, his voice dripping with mock sweetness. Enzo saw the movement. A cold dread colder than the lake water seized him. No! He yelled, shoving the man he was holding with such force that they both crashed into the wall. He threw himself towards Marina, his body covering hers just as Valente fired. The bullet meant for her slammed into the already wounded flesh of Enzo's left shoulder. The impact was staggering. A raw, guttural roar of pure agony was ripped from his throat. He collapsed against the wall, sliding down to the floor, his vision swimming with black spots, but his body still shielded hers. Marina screamed a sound of pure terror. She saw the fresh blood pouring from Enzo's shoulder the way his face had gone ashen. She saw Valente's cold, triumphant smile. In that moment, something inside her snapped. The fear, the confusion, the helplessness. It all coalesced into a single burning point of pure rage. Her father, Leo, who had been shoved aside in the kitchen, came rushing in armed with the only weapon he had ever known, a heavy wooden pizza peel. He swung it wildly, shouting in Italian, a desperate father trying to protect his child. One of Valente's men simply backhanded him across the face, sending him sprawling to the floor. Seeing her father fall was the final spark. Marina dropped from the window ledge. Her eyes fell on the bottle of whiskey she had used to clean, and Enzo's wound now half empty on the floor. Without thinking, she grabbed it. She ripped a strip of cloth from a nearby apron, stuffed it into the neck of the bottle, and then with a shaking hand, she snatched a book of matches from a crate of emergency supplies. Valente was walking slowly towards Enzo, savoring his victory. "It's over. Duca," he said, his voice low. "Your legacy dies here, and the girl she'll pay for the sins of her mother. You leave her alone," Enzo gritted out, trying to push himself up, but his left arm was useless, and the world was tilting on its axis. "I don't think so," Valente said, raising his pistol, aiming it directly at Enzo's head. "Hey!" Valente turned at the sound of Marina's voice. She was standing there, her face wreathed with flour and tears, her hazel eyes blazing with a fire he had never seen before. In her hand, she held the whiskey bottle, the cloth wick now burning with a small, airy flame. "Get away from him," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. Valente's smile widened. He was genuinely amused. "A little pizza girl with a Molotov cocktail. How quaint. What are you going to do, little one? Burn us all down?" "If I have to," she replied, her knuckles white around the neck of the bottle. It was a standoff, a Mafia don against a college student. Valente's amusement began to fade, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. This was taking too long. He gestured for his remaining conscious man to grab her. As the thug moved towards her, Marina didn't hesitate. She threw the bottle, but she didn't throw it at them. She threw it at the towering stacks of cardboard pizza boxes piled high in the corner of the room, boxes that were dry as tinder. The bottle shattered, and the flaming whiskey ignited the cardboard instantly. Flames erupted with a hungry whoosh, climbing the walls in seconds, feeding on the dry wood of the old building. Thick black smoke began to fill the small room. Chaos erupted. The smoke alarm began to shriek, a deafening, piercing wail. Valent's man, caught between the fire and his boss, panicked. Valente himself cursed, his eyes darting from the rapidly spreading flames to Enzo, then back to Marina. The situation had spiraled out of his control. "You foolish girl," he snarled, but his voice was tight with alarm. The fire was spreading faster than he could have imagined. This was Marina's chance. While they were distracted, she ran to her father, helping him to his feet. "Pop at the back door," she screamed over the alarm. Enzo, meanwhile, was using the wall to pull himself up. The smoke was thick, burning his lungs. Through the haze, he saw Valente hesitating. Enzo knew that in their world, hesitation was death. He lunged not with the cleaver, but with his own body, tackling Valente around the knees. They both went down hard. Enzo's head slammed against the concrete floor, and for a second, the world went black. But he held on, his one good arm wrapped around Valente's legs like a vice. "Get her!" Valente screamed at his man. But the thug was already scrambling for the exit, his face pale with fear of the fire. "Marina now!" Enzo yelled, his voice a raw command. Marina dragged her father toward the back door, the one that led to the dead-end alley. "It's blocked!" Leo coughed, his eyes streaming from the smoke. She looked around frantically. The flames were licking at the ceiling now. They were trapped. But then she remembered something. A story her father used to tell her about the old building. A story about prohibition, the cellar. She gasped. "Papa, the old bootlegger's tunnel." She pulled him towards a heavy trap door hidden under a stack of empty vegetable crates. It was old and rusted, but with their combined strength, they managed to wrench it open, revealing a set of steep stone steps leading down into the darkness. "Go," she urged her father. Leo hesitated, looking back at Enzo, who was still locked in a desperate struggle with Valente amidst the smoke and flames. "We can't leave him," Leo yelled. "He wouldn't want us to stay," Marina cried, her heart breaking. "Go, Papa. I'm right behind you." She gave her father one last push down the stairs and turned back. Through the swirling black smoke, she saw Enzo deliver a brutal headbutt to Valence's face. Valente staggered back, momentarily stunned. Enzo used the opportunity. He wasn't trying to escape. He was trying to buy her time. He looked at her, his emerald eyes cutting through the smoke. It was a look of finality, a silent goodbye. Then with a final desperate roar, he shoved a massive shelving unit over, bringing it crashing down, blocking the path between him and the cellar door, and sealing himself inside the inferno with his mortal enemy. Marina screamed his name, but the sound was lost in the roar of the fire. Her father pulled her down into the tunnel, just as the floor above them began to groan, threatening to collapse. The darkness of the tunnel swallowed them, and the last thing Marina saw was the hungry orange glow of the fire, consuming everything, consuming him. The darkness of the tunnel was absolute, a thick, suffocating blackness that swallowed all light and sound. It smelled of damp earth, of secrets left to rot for decades. Leo stumbled down the rough Hunstone steps, pulling a frantic Marina behind him. Her screams for Enzo were raw, tearing at her throat, but they were lost in the roar of the fire above them, a hungry beast consuming her world. "We have to go back," she cried, trying to wrench her arm from her father's grasp. "Papa, we can't just leave him. There is nothing to go back to." "Bumia." Leo's voice was a broken whisper thick with smoke and despair. "He is gone. He saved us. Now we must honor that." A heavy, cracking groan echoed from above, followed by a thunderous crash as a section of the pizzeria floor collapsed. The trapdoor, their only connection to the world above, was buried under a mountain of fire and debris. There was no going back. The finality of it hit Marina like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. A sob, raw and ragged, escaped her lips. He was gone. The man with emerald eyes, the ghost she had pulled from the lake, had vanished into the flames, taking a piece of her she didn't even know she had to give. Her father held her close in the suffocating darkness, his own body trembling. He knew what he was doing. Marina, he chose this. The tunnel was narrow and low. They shuffled forward in the pitch black, their hands scraping against the cold, damp brick walls. The air was stale, heavy with the ghosts of a bygone era of mobsters and speak-easies of secrets transported under the city's sleeping streets. Marina's mind was a numb void, replaying the last image she had of Enzo, his face streaked with flour and blood. His eyes burning through the smoke, a silent final command, "Go!" After what felt like an eternity, they saw a faint sliver of light ahead. It led to a heavy iron grate rusted shut with age. With their combined strength, they managed to push it open. The screech of metal on metal echoing in the confined space. They emerged gasping into another alley, 2 blocks away from the pizzeria, blinking against the harsh morning light. The air was filled with the sound of sirens growing closer. Smoke thick and black billowed into the sky from the direction they had just come. Gallows Pizzeria was an inferno. "Oh my God," Leo whispered, his hand flying to his mouth. Everything is gone." Marina stared at the column of smoke, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. It wasn't just the shop. It was her childhood, her memories, her father's life's work. And it was Enzo. all of it consumed by the flames. A police car screeched to a halt at the end of the alley. 2 officers jumped out. "Hey, you two, are you okay? Did you come from the fire?" Marina's mind, trained now by Enzo's harsh lessons in survival, worked with a cold, desperate clarity. There was a gas leak. She said the lie, coming easily, tasting like ash in her mouth. The oven, it just exploded. We barely got out. She clung to her father, forcing sobs, playing the part of the hysterical victim. It was a mask, a role, and she hated herself for it. But Enzo's last command echoed in her mind. Keep you safe. The next hours were a blur of police questions, paramedics, and the sympathetic, pitying faces of neighbors. Marina repeated her story about the gas leak over and over. Each time, the lie becoming more solid, more real, burying the truth of gunshots and mafia dons under a plausible tragedy. Her father, bless his heart, followed her lead. Too shocked and heartbroken to do anything else. They were taken to a shelter, given blankets and coffee. Marina sat on a cot, staring into space, the roar of the fire still echoing in her ears. She had done it. She had survived. She had protected her father. But the victory felt hollow, empty, because the ghost who had charged back into the fire to save her was now a ghost in truth. 2 weeks later, the shell of Gallows Pizzeria was a blackened skeletal ruin behind a chain-link fence. The insurance investigators had ruled the fire an accident, a faulty gas line, just as Marina had said. She and her father were staying in a small, temporary apartment, living off the meager insurance payout and the kindness of their community. Marina tried to return to her life. She went to her classes, sketched designs for buildings she would never build. But her focus was gone. The world of blueprints and stress load calculations felt trivial, a pale imitation of the life and death stakes she had just experienced. At night, she dreamed of emerald eyes and the smell of smoke. She searched the news obsessively. There was a brief mention of a fire in the warehouse district. The cause under investigation. There was no mention of bodies found. Not Enzo's, not Valente's. It was as if they had both been consumed by the flames and erased from existence. Part of her clung to a sliver of hope so thin it was transparent. He was a ghost, he had said. He was good at disappearing. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, as she was walking home from the university library, a sleek black town car pulled up beside her, its tinted windows gliding down silently. Marina froze, her heart instantly hammering against her ribs. A man in a sharp, dark suit sat in the back. He was older, with silver hair, and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. His eyes, however, were a familiar, startling shade of emerald green. "Marina Gallo." The man said, his voice a low, commanding rumble. It wasn't a question. Marina couldn't speak. She could only nod, her throat tight with a nameless emotion. "My name is Luciano Duca," the man said. "Enzo was my son." The word was hit her with the force of a physical blow. The transparent sliver of hope she had been clutching shattered into a million tiny pieces. "He was dead. It was real." "I understand," Luciano continued, his gaze unwavering, "that you were with him at the end. I also understand that you saved his life before that." He paused, his eyes softening almost imperceptibly. "My son, he did not make friends easily. He did not trust anyone. For him to sacrifice himself for you, it means you were important to him." Tears welled in Marina's eyes, hot and sudden. I'm so sorry," she stammered. "Do not be sorry," Luciano said, his voice firm. "You did what no one else could. You gave my son's death a purpose. He died protecting someone innocent." He leaned forward slightly. "The Duca family pays its debts. Enzo told you that, I believe. Your father's pizzeria will be rebuilt better than before. Your university will be paid for. You and your father will want for nothing for the rest of your lives. It was an offer of a lifetime, a golden cage, a reward for her silence, for her complicity. I don't want your money, Marina said, her voice finding its strength. Luciano raised an eyebrow. No. Then what do you want, Miss Gallo? I want to know why she said the words tumbling out in a rush of grief and anger. Why did this happen, Valente? He said something about my mother. He said I would pay for her mistake. What did he mean? A shadow passed over Luciano Duca's face. He was silent for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Some doors, he said, finally his voice low and dangerous, are better left unopened. Your mother made a choice a long time ago, a choice to walk away from our world. You should honor that choice. She was a nurse, Marina insisted. A good person. What could she have possibly done? She saw something she shouldn't have. Luciano said, his voice flat, final. And she made a deal with my father to forget it. Valente, breaking that deal is a complication. But it is a Duca matter now, not yours. Take the money, Miss Gallo. Build your buildings. Live your life. Forget you ever met my son. He was dismissing her, closing the door on the past, on the questions that were now burning a hole in her soul. She was just a loose end to be tied up, a debt to be paid and forgotten. The anger that had sparked in the storage room flared again, hot and bright. No, she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that surprised them both. Luciano's eyes narrowed. No, your son saved my life, she said, her voice shaking but resolute. He died to protect me and my father. That's not a debt you can pay off with a check. You want to honor him. Then you tell me the truth. You tell me what happened to my mother, and you help me make Antonio Valente pay for what he did to Enzo. She was standing on the rainsicle sidewalk, a mere student challenging the patriarch of one of Chicago's most powerful crime families. It was insane. It was suicidal. Luciano Duca stared at her, his stone-like expression unreadable. For a full minute, the only sound was the drumming of the rain on the car roof. Marina held his gaze, refusing to back down. Finally, a slow, grim smile touched Luciano's lips. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes, but it held a grudging respect. You have a fire in you, Miss Gallo, he said, his voice a low rumble. A fire I haven't seen in a long time. He leaned back against the leather seat. My son had good taste. He paused, his gaze turning distant, thoughtful. Get in the car. It seems we have much to discuss. As Marina opened the car door, leaving the world of blueprints and pizza dough behind for good, she knew she was stepping into a world of shadows and secrets, a world from which there was no return. She was no longer just building things. Now she was going to help tear something down. The interior of the town car was like a different universe. The roar of the city and the drumming of the rain were instantly muted, replaced by a tomb-like silence. The air smelled of rich leather and Luciano Duca's expensive, smoky cologne. Marina sank into the plush seat, her rain-dampened clothes feeling cheap and out of place. The door closed with a heavy final thud, severing her connection to the life she had known just moments before. They drove in silence through the glistening streets of Chicago. Luciano didn't speak, his gaze fixed on the cities passing by the tinted window. But Marina could feel his presence filling the small space, a weight of authority and unspoken history. She watched the familiar landmarks of her city, the Art Institute, Millennium Park, the towering Willis Tower. But they looked different now, like the backdrop to a story she was only just beginning to understand. Finally, the car turned into a private gated street in the upscale Gold Coast neighborhood, pulling up before a magnificent gray stone mansion that looked more like a fortress than a home. A man in a dark suit opened her door. Luciano led her inside, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor of the grand foyer. The house was opulent but somber, filled with dark wood, heavy velvet curtains, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow her. It was a house built on power and secrets, and it felt cold, devoid of life. He led her into a study, a room lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, filled with leather-bound volumes. A fire crackled in a massive stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He gestured for her to sit in a deep leather armchair before pouring 2 glasses of a dark amber liquid from a crystal decanter. He handed one to her. "Bry," he said. "You look like you could use one." Marina took the glass, her fingers wrapping around its cool, heavy surface. She had never felt more like a child playing dress-up in an adult's world. Lutano settled into the chair opposite her, the firelight glinting in his emerald eyes, Enzo's eyes. The resemblance was so striking it made her heart ache. "You asked about your mother," he began, his voice low, "and about Antonio Valente." Marina leaned forward, her entire being focused on his words. 25 years ago, Luciano set his gaze drifting into the flames. The Valente family and my family, the Ducas, were not rivals. We were partners. We controlled the city's shipping unions, the docks, everything that moved in and out of the Great Lakes. My father, Enzo's grandfather, was the Don. Valence's father was his underboss. He took a slow sip of his brandy, but the Valentes were always ambitious. They wanted more. He paused, the silence stretching. There was a deal, a large shipment of unregulated pharmaceuticals coming in from Europe. It was supposed to be a joint operation, a 50-50 split, but the Valentes got greedy. They planned to hijack the shipment, kill my father's men, and pin the blame on a rival Irish crew. Marina listened, her mind struggling to connect this violent, distant history to the mother she remembered, the woman who smelled of antiseptic and sang her Italian lullabies. "The plan went wrong," Lutaniano continued, his voice hardening. "There was a shootout at the docks. Many men died, including my father." He stared into the fire, the memory still raw after all these years. Valente's father seized power, claiming the Ducas had grown weak. He consolidated our territories, our operations. He built his empire on the ashes of my family. But what does this have to do with my mother? Marina pressed her voice, a whisper. Luciano finally looked at her, his eyes holding a deep, ancient sadness. "Your mother, Eleonora Gallo, was a triage nurse on duty at Chicago General that night. She treated one of the survivors from the docks, one of my father's men. Before he died, he told her everything. He told her it wasn't the Irish. He told her it was Valente who had set them up, who had murdered my father." Marina gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Her mother, a witness. Valente found out, Luciano said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. He sent men to the hospital to silence her, but she was smart. She had already gone to the police. The problem was the police were on Valence's payroll. The detective she spoke to tipped him off. He shook his head slowly. Your mother was a dead woman walking. She had nowhere to turn. So she came to the only other person in the city who wanted Valente to pay. Me. He stood up and walked to a large, ornate desk, unlocking a drawer with a small silver key. He pulled out an old yellowed file and handed it to her. I had just taken over what was left of the Duca organization. I was young, angry, and out for blood. Your mother, she was Mikey. Her testimony could have destroyed Valente before he even began. Marina opened the file with trembling hands. Inside were old police reports, grainy black and white photos of the docks, and a sworn affidavit signed in her mother's elegant, looping script. It detailed everything the dying mobster had told her. So what happened? Marina asked, her voice choked with emotion. Why didn't she testify? Because she was pregnant, Lutano said softly. With you. He pointed to a line in the report. She found out the day after the shootout. She came to me not just to offer her testimony, but to beg for protection for her unborn child. She knew that if she testified, Valente would hunt you both to the ends of the earth. She made a deal with me, her silence in exchange for her life, for your life. The truth was a punch to the gut. Her mother hadn't just been a nurse. She had been a woman caught in a war, a woman who had sacrificed justice for her daughter's safety. I honored that deal, Luciano continued. I used my remaining influence to create a new identity for her to erase her past. I arranged for her to meet your father Leo, a good man completely outside of our world. I watched from a distance as she built a new, quiet life. I promised her that as long as she remained silent, the Ducas would ensure that the Valentes never touched her. He closed his eyes for a moment. It was a fragile piece, but it held until now. So Valente knew who I was. All along, Marina whispered in horror. No, Luciano said, I don't believe so. To him, your mother was a loose end that simply vanished. But when my son, my reckless, foolish son, got himself shot and ended up in your care, you put yourself back on their radar. When Marco reported that a pizza girl had helped Enzo Valente, must have dug into your name. Gallo. It was a name he hadn't heard in 25 years, but one he would never forget. He realized who you were, the daughter of the woman who could have destroyed his family. It all clicked into place. The fire. Valent's chilling words. She'll pay for her mother's mistake. It wasn't just about Enzo. It was about finishing a job that had been left undone for a quarter of a century. Enzo. Marina's voice broke. Did he know? Luciano shook his head. No. I never told him the details of his grandfather's death or about the witness who got away. It was a part of the past I wanted to bury. He fought Valente because he was our rival, our enemy. He died for you because you were an innocent who saved him. He never knew that your lives had been connected since before you were even born. Marina closed the weight of the past pressing down on her, her mother's secret. Enzo's sacrifice. It was all a tangled, bloody knot of fate. You said you want to make Valente pay. Lutaniano said, his voice pulling her back to the present. He walked back to his chair, his emerald eyes boring into hers. Revenge is a cold and bitter meal, Miss Gallo. It will consume you. It will change you. Are you sure this is the path you want to walk? Marina thought of Enzo's face in the fire of her father being struck down, of her mother's hidden sacrifice. The quiet life she had once cherished was gone, burned away in the flames of the pizzeria. There was no going back. There was only forward. She looked up, meeting Luciano Duca's gaze without flinching. Her voice was steady, cold, and clear. He took my mother's voice. He took your son's life. He tried to take mine, she said. I don't just want him to pay. I want to be the one who delivers the bill. For the second time that day, Luciano Duca smiled. This time it reached his eyes. Good, he said. Because I happen to have an opening for an architect. We have an empire to rebuild and another one to tear down. The study was a world of ghosts. The ghost of Enzo, whose presence lingered in the sharp, intelligent eyes of his father. The ghost of Marina's mother, a woman she now understood, had lived a life of quiet, desperate courage. And the ghost of the innocent girl Marina herself used to be, now buried under the ashes of the pizzeria. For the next week, the Duca mansion became her sanctuary and her training ground. Luciano was a man of few words, but his actions were decisive. He moved Marina and her father into a secure, lavish guest wing of the estate, far from the prying eyes of the world. Leo Gallo, a simple man overwhelmed by the sudden shift from the smell of baking bread to the cold silence of marble hallways, spent his days in a state of bewildered grief, cared for by the mansion's silent staff. He didn't ask questions. He knew with a father's intuition that he didn't want to know the answers. Marina, however, wanted to know everything. She devoured the contents of the yellowed file, reading her mother's affidavit again and again. The words, a heartbreaking testament to a choice made 25 years ago. Luciano, recognizing the same unyielding fire in her that he had once seen in his son, began to treat her not as a victim to be protected, but as an apprentice, an architect of a different kind of structure. Revenge. Valente is not a fool, Luciano said one evening as they sat across from each other over a massive oak table in the war room, a high-tech command center hidden behind the library's bookshelves. Maps of Chicago financial charts and surveillance feeds glowed on a wall of monitors. He is a snake. He strikes from the shadows. To kill a snake, you don't chase it into the grass. You smoke it out of its hole. How? Marina asked, her voice steady. Every empire, no matter how powerful, has cracks in its foundation, Luciano explained, his long fingers tracing a line on a digital map that highlighted Valente. Valente's weakness is the same as his father's greed. He's been using the old docide to move more than just legitimate cargo narcotics weapons untaxed. He's built a network of shell corporations to launder the money. But the paper trail, if you know how to read it, is a roadmap to his destruction. You want me to find it, Marina stated, understanding dawning in her eyes. It was not a question. Lutano gave a slight, appreciative nod. You're an architect. You understand structure weak points, blueprints. A financial empire is no different. It's a structure of numbers and lies. I need you to find the flaw in his design. And so her new education began. Luciano's top men, a team of grizzled, loyal veterans, taught her everything they knew. A former MSAD agent named Gabriel taught her surveillance and counter-surveillance, how to move through the city without being seen, how to read the subtle language of shadows and reflections. A disgraced but brilliant forensic accountant named Simon taught her how to navigate the labyrinthine world of offshore accounts and shell corporations, how to follow the scent of dirty money through layers of digital deception. Marina was a natural. Her mind, trained to see patterns and structural integrity in buildings, saw the same things in data. She worked relentlessly, fueled by a cold, burning fury. The grief for Enzo was a constant ache in her chest, a wound that would not heal, but she channeled it. She turned her pain into focus, her sorrow into a weapon. During the day, she was a diligent student. But at night, alone in her opulent room, the ghost returned. She would stand on the balcony looking out at the glittering, indifferent lights of the city, and she would talk to him, to Enzo, as if he were standing there beside her. I'm learning to break things now, she would whisper into the wind, just like you. One night, while poring over a complex web of Valenta, she found it. A single recurring anomaly, a small, seemingly insignificant payment made every month for 25 years, from one of Valente's oldest shell companies to a defunct pension fund for a longshoremen's union. The payments had started the month after Enzo's grandfather was killed. It's a ghost payment, Simon explained, his eyes lighting up as he looked over her shoulder. A payment to an non-existent entity. It's a classic way to hide a payoff, a bribe. But why keep it going for so long? Because it's not a bribe, Marina said, a sudden chilling realization dawning on her. It's blackmail. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, cross-referencing the pension fund's old records. Most of the names were of men long dead, but one name was still active, though the address was a P.O. box. The name was Detective Miller, the same detective her mother had reported the murder to all those years ago. He didn't just tip Valente off. Marina breathed, her heart pounding. He buried the evidence, and Valente's father has been paying for his silence ever since. And now Valente continues the payments. Luciano finished her thought, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. Because that one loose end could unravel his entire empire. He looked at Marina, his admiration clear. You found the whole architetto. Now we smoke the snake out. The plan was simple, and it was brutal. Lutano's men persuaded the now retired Detective Miller to cooperate. Faced with the choice between a comfortable retirement and a shallow grave, Miller chose wisely. He provided Luciano with the location of the original buried evidence from the 1999 shootout, the file he was paid to make disappear. The next step was Marina's. Armed with this new explosive information, she was to be the architect of Valente's downfall. He thinks you're a frightened little girl, Tas Luciano said as he handed her a small, encrypted burner phone. He'll be expecting me to come at him with guns. He won't be expecting you. What do you want me to do? She asked, her voice calm. I want you to call him. Luciano, said his emerald eyes glinting. And I want you to set a meeting. Tell him you have something that belonged to your mother, something he's been paying for a very long time. The phone felt unnaturally heavy in Marina's hand. She dialed the number Luciano had given her, her heart a steady cold drum against her ribs. The fear was still there, a knot in the pit of her stomach, but it was different now. It was a whet stone sharpening her resolve. The phone rang twice before a familiar smooth voice answered. Valente, this is Marina Gallo. She said, her voice clear and devoid of emotion. There was a pause on the other end, a beat of surprised silence, then a low chuckle. The little pizza girl. I have to admit, I'm impressed. I thought you'd be halfway to Mexico by now, or at the bottom of a river. Luciano Duca is getting soft in his old age, taking in strays. I have something that belonged to my mother, Marina said, ignoring his taunts, cutting straight to the point. A file. I believe you've spent a great deal of money over the years to keep it buried. The silence on the other end was longer this time, heavier. When he spoke again, the amusement was gone, replaced by a silky, dangerous edge. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do. Marina pressed on. Detective Miller's pension has been very well funded, hasn't it? For a man who retired 20 years ago. She heard a sharp intake of breath. She had him. What do you want? Valente's voice was a low growl now. A meeting, she said. Just you and me. The old pier at the Navy Yard. Midnight. Come alone. You'll get the file, and I'll disappear from your life, just like my mother did. It was a lie. Of course, she would never disappear. But it was a lie. He wanted to believe a loose end. He would be desperate to tie up himself. If this is a trap, he began to threaten. If it's a trap, you'll never see the file. She cut him off. And by morning, every news station and federal prosecutor in Chicago will. Your choice. She hung up before he could respond, her hand shaking slightly. It was done. The trap was set. He'll come, Luciano said from across the room. He had been listening to the entire conversation. His pride won't let him send anyone else. He'll want to look you in the eye as he kills you. I know, Marina said quietly. That night, the Navy pier was a skeleton of rusted steel and rotting wood, silhouetted against the city's glow. The wind howled, whipping cold spray off the choppy waters of the lake. It was the kind of night where ghosts walked. Marina stood at the end of the pier, a small, solitary figure against the vast, dark expanse of the water. The wind tore at her hair, whipping it across her face. She held a large manila envelope in her hand. The bait. She was alone, just as she had promised. Or so it appeared. Hidden in the shadows of the crumbling warehouses, Luciano's men were in position, silent snipers with night vision scopes. Gabriel was perched on a nearby rooftop, a high-powered rifle resting on its bipod, his calm professional gaze sweeping the area. Luciano himself sat in a darkened car a block away, watching the scene unfold on a series of monitors, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. He had given his word that he would protect her, but he hated this. He hated using her as bait, using his sons, whatever she was to him, in this deadly game. A single pair of headlights cut through the darkness. A black Maserati Valence signature car pulled up at the entrance to the pier. He got out, a tall, imposing figure in a long, dark coat. He was alone. He walked slowly down the pier, his footsteps echoing on the weathered planks. The wind whipped his coat around him. He looked like a creature of the night, a predator in his natural habitat. He stopped a few feet from Marina, his face unreadable in the shadows. "You have something for me," he said, his voice smooth as silk. Marina held up the envelope. "It's all here. The affidavit. The original police report Miller buried." Valence's eyes glinted. "A foolish girl playing a man's game. Your mother was smarter. She knew when to run." "My mother ran to protect me," Marina said, her voice shaking with a cold fury. "I'm staying to get justice for her and for Enzo." The name hung in the air between them. Valence's face hardened. Enzo was a casualty of war, a war his family started. You should have stayed out of it. He took a step closer, holding out his hand. "Give me the file." Marina clutched it to her chest. "Not yet. I want to hear you say it. I want to hear you admit what you did to my mother, why you hunted her." Valente laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that was snatched away by the wind. "You want a confession? Fine. Your mother was a loose end, a nobody who stuck her nose where it didn't belong. I would have killed her then, and I will kill you now. It's just business." He lunged faster than she could have anticipated, his hand grabbing for the envelope. But Marina was ready. She had spent the last week training with Gabriel. She sidestepped, letting his momentum carry him past her. As he stumbled, she brought her knee up hard into his side. Valente grunted in pain and surprise. He spun around, his face contorted in a mask of fury. "You little bitch," he snarled, pulling a small silver pistol from his coat. But before he could raise it, a single, almost silent thip sound cut through the air. A small red dot appeared on the back of Valence's gun hand. He cried out, his hands spasming, the gun clattering to the pier. Simultaneously, the pier was flooded with light as a dozen of Luciano's men emerged from the shadows, their weapons all trained on the wounded, bewildered Don. Valente stared at his bleeding hand, then at Marina, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had walked into a perfectly executed trap. "It's over, Antonio." Enzo Duca's voice boomed from a loudspeaker on one of the cars. He stepped out of his vehicle, walking slowly onto the pier, every inch the patriarch reclaiming his city. Marina stood her ground, her heart pounding, not with fear, but with a fierce, triumphant energy. She looked down at the man who had terrorized her family for a generation, now kneeling on the pier, disarmed and surrounded. "You said I was playing a man's game," she said, her voice clear and strong above the wind. "You were wrong. I was just finishing one." Luciano stopped beside her, placing a heavy paternal hand on her shoulder. He looked down at his defeated rival. "My son sent his regards," he said, his voice as cold and merciless as the lake water below. The legacy of the Valente Empire ended that night, not with a bang, but with the quiet, efficient cleanup of the Duca organization. Antonio Valente simply vanished, another ghost claimed by the city's dark waters. In the months that followed, Chicago's underworld shifted. The fall of the Valente family created a power vacuum, and Luciano Duca, with a quiet and ruthless precision, filled it. The Duca Empire rose from the ashes, stronger and more disciplined than before. And at the heart of this reconstruction was an unlikely architect. Marina did not return to her old life. She couldn't. The girl who dreamed of designing buildings of glass and steel was gone, replaced by a woman who now understood the architecture of power. She finished her degree, but she didn't pursue a career in a downtown firm. Instead, she stayed by Luciano's side, becoming his most trusted advisor, his confidant. He rebuilt Gallo's Pizzeria for her father, a magnificent state-of-the-art restaurant in Little Italy. But Leo never truly recovered. The ghosts of that night were too strong. He eventually retired, leaving the business to a cousin, and moved to a quiet cottage in the countryside, content to spend his days gardening and trying to forget. Marina visited him often, their conversations carefully skirting the edges of her new life. He never asked, she never told. Her life was now one of stark contrasts. By day, she oversaw the Duca's legitimate businesses: real estate holdings, construction firms, import-export companies, using her sharp mind and architectural eye to build a respectable facade for the organization. She was brilliant at it, turning shadowy assets into profitable, legitimate enterprises. But by night, she sat with Luciano in the war room, learning the darker side of the empire. She learned about loyalty and betrayal, about the necessary cruelties of survival in a world without rules. Lutaniano taught her everything he knew, molding her not into a gangster, but into a queen. He saw in her the same sharp intellect and unwavering resolve he had seen in Enzo, tempered with the compassion and a moral compass that his son had often lacked. She was, he realized, the future of his family. Yet amidst the power and the strategy, Marina was haunted. The ghost of Enzo was a constant presence. She would often find herself in the mansion's vast library, running her fingers over the leather-bound books, imagining him there. She never spoke of him to Luciano, and he never mentioned his son's name. It was a shared, unspoken grief, a wound too deep for words. One cold winter evening, a year after the fire, Luciano called her into his study. The fire was roaring, just as it had been on the first day she had come to the mansion. "I am getting old, Marina," he said, his voice weary. "This world, it requires a strength I no longer have." He looked at her, his emerald eyes so like Enzo's, filled with a heavy gravity. The family needs a new leader. Someone smart, strong, and respected. They need you. Marina was stunned. Me? But I'm not. I'm not a Duca. I'm not one of you. You are more a Duca than most who carry the name, he countered. You have the mind for it, and you have the heart. Enzo saw it. I see it too. He leaned forward. He died for you, Marina. In our world, that creates a bond stronger than blood. You are bound to this family now. Whether you like it or not, it was a coronation and a condemnation, all at once. The final closing of the door on the life she might have had. There is something else, Luciano said, his voice dropping. He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket and pushed it across the polished desk towards her. Enzo, he had this made for you in the days before. He was going to give it to you. With trembling fingers, Marina opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was a locket. It was a simple, elegant piece of white gold. She opened it. On one side was a tiny, impossibly detailed engraving of a compass, rose the kind found on architectural drawings. On the other side, there was an inscription, 4 simple words. Build me a wall. A sob, sharp and painful, caught in her throat. His last words to her he had remembered. He had understood. It wasn't just a command. It was a plea. Build me a wall. Protect yourself. Stay safe. But it was also a challenge. Build something that will last. The tears she had held back for a year finally fell, silent drops that splashed onto the velvet bob. It wasn't a declaration of love, not in the traditional sense. It was something more profound. It was a confession, an acknowledgement of the broken world he inhabited, and a desperate hope that she could build something better, something stronger. She looked up at Luciano, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I'll do it," she said, her voice a raw whisper. "I'll lead this family, but we will do it my way. We will build something new, something that lasts." Luciano nodded slowly, a deep, abiding respect in his eyes. "I know you will, Mia. I know you will." Marina closed her hand around the locket, its cool metal a comforting weight against her skin. She was no longer Marina Gallo, the pizza girl. She was no longer just the architect. She was the inheritor of a ghost's legacy, the architect of a new kind of empire. Her path was set a dark and dangerous road stretching out before her. But she would not walk it alone. She had the memory of a man who had died for her, and the promise of a future she would build not just with steel and glass, but with the unbreakable strength she had found in the ashes of her old life. The ghost of Enzo Duca was gone, but his queen was just beginning her reign.